Hello, welcome again to Chile Talk. I'm Neil Davidson. I'm with Pete Lee, and today we are going to talk about the new constitution that is being discussed and its details not finalized, but Pete, the Constitutional Convention, how much time has it got left?
Well, we've got the draft in, and over the next month and a bit into July, we're going to formulate the final item. The members of the Constitutional Convention are on a tour, a little bit like the Inquisition, moving around, holding autos de fe in different areas and spreading the gospel. We don't know whether that's going to work in favor of approving it, Apruebo, or in favor of rejecting it, rechazo.
Okay, now we're going to deal with this for the moment in two parts. This little episode is going to be about Apruebo, agree, accept. Why would one want to accept this constitution as it's currently shaping up? So what is in it? Give us some bullet points there, Pete.
Well, it's very long. It's very long indeed. It's got 499 clauses, world record.
So this isn't the United States Declaration of Independence or anything like that. It's a
similar level of poetry, perhaps, a modernized level of poetry. It's hard to predict whether there will be originalists in the future trying to read what was meant when these words were formulated, but it's a slightly different style. It does fall within the general Hispanic legal tradition of trying to formulate reality through written law, which we've mentioned before in Chile Talk.
So as opposed, ideally, to the Anglo-Saxon tradition, where you merely say what you're not allowed to do in the law, this is a tradition where you kind of try and really somehow encompass the whole of reality.
Yes, and always remaining open to sort of the corpus of law and thought in the past and its contextual meaning in the present, the common law, effectively.
Right, yes, precedent obviously is very important in the Hispanic as well as the Anglo-Saxon system in slightly different ways.
Statutes are much more important in the Hispanic tradition.
So what is in the Constitution then? There's, see, I have not been, I've not been following this very closely. I'm in England. You've been following it much more closely. You're the person who knows. There's, all this stuff coming out that they're going to abolish the Senate. For a start.
Yeah,
so what kind of government? There was talk at one time of having a parliamentary system and not a presidential one, but that's gone out the window, right?
Yes, well, it's going to have a kind of, I suppose you'd say, asymmetrical two-house system. There'll be no Senate, and instead there'll be a regional assembly, which sounds a bit like a Senate. Chile doesn't have a strong tradition of the kind of regional Senate that exists in, for example, the United States or in Australia, where in some internally asymmetrical way, different political units within a country are represented as a check and balance, usually conservative compared to the more one person, one vote democracy that lower houses aim for.
Okay, essentially it's solving the problem of how do you have a second chamber which doesn't simply replicate the first, either it's not just simply directly elected. And in Britain, they discovered that was quite difficult when they started getting rid of the lords, the hereditary voting rights, and couldn't really think what to put in their place. And so obviously the regional chamber is a pretty good kind of compromise, isn't it?
Yes, well, we'll have to revisit that in the companion piece on rechazo, but it is a new thing, which could be good. That's one of the better things that can be said for that plan. There are also a few ideas that have been fashionable sort of in social science and international advisory, like interculturality, which we use in the Spanish-speaking world particularly, plurinationalism, which in the Andean countries has been formulated. The Andean countries such as Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador have fairly large communities of people who speak indigenous languages, and they've been recognized in the law. That works for them. Chile, there are Chileans who certainly like the idea as well. They'd like to recognize the original peoples, as we call the groups that are recognized as being, I guess, polities that predate the colony of different.
That's it. I mean, this is obviously very similar to multiculturalism, except it's mainly about indigenous peoples, isn't it, rather than immigrants. I mean, in Chile, by and large, it's all, well, I suppose mass immigration is so new that at the moment there's no expectation that large groups of immigrants will maintain a separate identity, really. There's a Jewish community, but it's tiny. There's a large number of people who are supposedly of Palestinian origin, but they don't really form a separate society. It is all about indigenous peoples, isn't it? And Chile hasn't got that many. I mean, it's rather like England and Wales. You know, here you have a separate nation with its own language, etc., but it's very small compared to the other one, right? And it's the same in Chile.
Yes, there are certainly some groups that do have continuity. They do have demonstrable continuity as communities, and they are recognized collectively, you know, which is interesting. On the front of different groups from different places, such as the Jews or the Palestinians or other Arabs or Levantines, if you like, we traditionally call such groups colonies, and we would call the people descended from those groups, at least for a long time in the 19th century and the 20th century, we'd talk of the colony. Usually not very many women came out into the colony, so they were mixed in with different groups, either the general population, or if they were upwardly mobile colonies, and they often were because they were much welcomed as reinforcements in the society, often they'd marry into the upper classes, and so we have.
So they would tend to disappear as separate entities.
Yes.
And also they were not replenished. There was a period of immigration from Palestine, whatever, the Near East, and then it stopped essentially.
Yes.
So there's no conveyor belt.
And they might have a club. There are clubs like German clubs and
football teams,
kinds of Arab clubs and football teams that do have a continuation of the tradition, but usually they don't keep many of the customs up, or the customs that they do keep up are heavily mixed in with the local context.
That's it. Okay, so we've touched on the second chamber. We've touched on this idea of plurinationality. These are, and what else is in there? What's another sort of big comprehensible thing that's in there?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of what is often celebrated or denounced as identity-oriented elements, which we can go into at some length. But one of the continuities between this and previous constitutional traditions in Chile is that this does look like corporatism to me. It celebrates certain groups and how they come together in the state. The people who came up with this formulation didn't know they were doing that, but they have inadvertently achieved corporatism again.
Well, this is very interesting because this is what we associate with the early stage of the dictatorship, isn't it? Under the influence of Jaime Guzman, which in itself was a kind of borrowing from fascist Italy, if I'm not mistaken. And what here is in Chile is called gremialismo. Gremio being a guild or whatever, or some, you know, interest group or business group.
Yes. Literally a lap or a bosom.
Gremio?
Yes. That's what it is.
Oh, okay,
yes.
I'll take your word for it. So that's so interesting. So I'm sure that the drafters of the Constitution would be horrified to know to think they were replicating the work of Pinochet's dictatorship. But
Well,
I
not
mean,
replicating it.
but I mean, thinking along the same lines.
Yes, I mean, it's entirely accidental and no one's told them yet. And that's the general spirit of the document is, in many ways, it's so bad, it's good. It's very Chilean. They're practicing a continuity of Chilenidad, of Chileanness, while thinking that they're making some kind of revolutionary intervention on the ways of the past.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because I was thinking, that probably the way this constitution would turn out, that it would be a snapshot of whatever happens to be fashionable at the moment, which is like, identity politics, multiculturalism, which is going to look very funny in 30 years. But it might just be that a kind of deeper continuity then has been, a subterranean continuity has come up.
Well, I think there is this contemporaneity of it. Is that the word? Contemporaneity.
Contemporaneity, I suppose.
Got it. You've got it. I mean, there are very aspirational definitions of what the Chileans are and their variegated groupings and identities that very much reflect current pieties, the forms of piety that the Chileans seem to enjoy. And a lot of those pieties are quite nice, they're quite entertaining. So it has that going for it. And it does seem kind of new, while of course being much the same as always. Of course, one of the very positive things about this is it's very important that Chile have a new constitution, because it's very important that the Chileans have something new to blame rather than blaming the constitution from 1980. That's not helping them.
This is it. There is a slight feeling of being stuck in the past, isn't there? It's interesting how young writers, young novelists, seem to write so many novels about the dictatorship, and you think it's like kind of us writing novels almost about the Second World War or something by this stage. You write a novel about Gallipoli, whatever. I mean, okay, I'm exaggerating a bit. As if every young Australian novelist were writing about Gallipoli.
Yes.
But there is this feeling of needles stuck, isn't there? So yeah. So this.
Yes, I mean, there's a sort of unique event part of the Pinochet dictatorship, which of course is modelled after Holocaust memorialization, where it's a unique catastrophe. So it is understandable that it's constantly revisited, and of course it's reinforced by the international image of Chile and certainly the promotion of Pinochet as top dictator.
He's Chile's most famous son, isn't he, really? Which is a shame. And Allende's obviously pretty well known too. So this is the kind of last really big, internationally well-known thing that happened in Chile before the rescue of the miners, I suppose.
We've forgotten that. Yeah. Now another good thing I have to say for this constitution is it's close to unreadable in and of itself. Chile doesn't have a very high rate of reading. Functional literacy is quite low, in the 30s. 30-something% of Chileans could read a paragraph of text, and this one's got about 499 of them.
And that's normal text, and this is kind of Chilean Hispanic legalese, right?
Yes, I mean, it is readable, but there's a lot of it altogether. So by being unreadable, it's very unlikely to be closely policed in its entirety, and it invites an abstract level of interpretation by constitutional jurists. So it will be subject to a coherent constitutional tradition over time. Expert people will have to find a way to extract some kind of golden thread in its argument.
Got it. So it's like a large lump of rock from which the constitution will have to be somehow chiseled at a later date, is what you're saying.
Yes. And that's interesting. One of the things that popped up in Chile's current political turmoil is the suggestion that one way that the government might make more meaningful interventions at the moment, given the problems it has cameralistically within the parliament and even within its own coalition, is by implementing certain choice rule by decree aspects, which is a tradition in Chile pretty much forever, but was a very strong feature of the last time that Chile had a constitution, a new constitution that wasn't fully implemented, the Constitution of 1925, which was developed by Arturo Alessandri, who started off as a kind of semi-revolutionary figure and became more and more conservative. But his arch enemy, Carlos Ibáñez del Campo, the founder of the Carabineros, we've spoken about him before, he intervened and took over in a dictatorship in 1927. The Constitution of 1925 was never fully implemented. A big part of the notion of that constitution was to make the presidential figure stronger. The presidential figure was certainly very much weakened in the Civil War of 1891. And as far as Alessandri could see, we needed a stronger president to have some kind of coherent program. That presidential feature did hold through, and one expression of it was occasional use of rule by decree. For example, at the end of the radical presidents in the late 1940s, we had González Videla, who ruled by decree. He had all kinds of problems with the communists and others, socialists, and occasionally he resorted to rule by decree. Now, when you do rule by decree, unless you're in a full dictatorship, you have to make sure that you've got the people on your side with your decree, or you're going to cause some instability. Another example is the government of Eduardo Frei Montalva from the mid-60s to 1970. And he ruled by decree occasionally, despite the fact that he had a very strong mandate, 55% of the vote he was voted in with, in an open running against all candidates. He still wasn't able to run through normal parliamentary procedures a coherent program, and as such, he resorted to rule by decree. Certainly, Salvador Allende thought about it, but he was much supervised. And well, at the suggestion that there might be rule by decree now, certainly people from the centrist parties, the Socialist Party, for example, were keen to point out, no, that's something dictatorial. We can't have
but
that.
This is something, are you saying this is something that's an option that's always been open to the president under successive constitutions?
I think if the constitution is not working, such as the Constitution of 1925, never fully implemented, it was always understood that some level of discretion should be exercised. But it's not exactly democracy. It's not exactly democracy.
Okay.
So,
but it is an option that's open then to the president.
Yes, I mean, what happens, there are presidential decrees, but over uncontroversial things like giving you an extra holiday or something. Not over major things. You'd have a constitutional crisis if that were to happen.
Okay, but it can be done. It's like a kind of nuclear option that could conceivably be used in
yes.
circumstances.
And the point I'd like to make there is if the constitution is a bit of a shambles and does look like a bit of a shambles, it would be possible to supplement it with some kind of rule of decree if you've got a charismatic leader who can read the people's tastes enough and sell it to them properly. That is an option going forward. And I mean, as a denouement to this discussion, one of the things we can say in favour of approving of the Constitution is that it's pretty obvious that if it is approved, it's going to have to be reformed from the get-go just to be a usable instrument. So if you think it's bad, it's probably not as bad as it looks.
Okay, and I suppose you might just add that various American investment banks have now looked at it, haven't they? I think Merrill Lynch, I think Bank of America, and they don't seem to find it too dreadful. They seem to think they could live with it, as it's some of the more apocalyptic versions you hear in Chile. Don't seem
Well,
to
there
be.
was I guess the English humor, the humor inglés, in describing it as reasonable, was probably missed by some of the Chilean commentators who grasped that word, particularly most disastrously the newsreader and commentator Daniel Matamala, who didn't seem to understand what was in the analysis coming out of, was it Merrill Lynch or Morgan Stanley? I think Morgan Stanley. He didn't seem to follow the nuance of what had been said. He may not have read it, and he cited out of context in a kind of ad hominem attack on Axel Kaiser, the wonderful agent provocateur, wonderfully entertaining guy. And yes, what is a reasonable constitution? Well, it depends what the expectations are of whoever's doing the reasoning. So,
Okay, good. Yeah. Well, okay. Anyway, let's keep this. Let's bring this to an end. We should try and be short and sweet. We should be returning, I think, several more times to the Constitution. Here's a first taste, and thank you very much for joining us here on Chile Talk, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.